It's News from Heaven. Welcome back, everybody. It's great to be here. Hopefully you feel the same way. Today we're going to be looking at an interview with spirits 3 days after they died, which is either like a long time after the cessation of consciousness on Earth, or it's like, oh, your next life is just starting. Hopefully as we dig through stuff like this, we get you in a good mood. I mean, it seems like strange to make that connection, but that's what we're hoping for. I find when I dig into Swedenborg's material, which is what we do on this show, we try to figure out life in the mind by taking an annotated journey through the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg. Who cares if I say it right? I find just getting back to this perspective is a good grounding, centering, anchoring thing for me. Hopefully it is for you too, and hopefully you feel like liking and subscribing, because that's gonna ground and center and anchor our chances to make it out there in the algorithm. Now what we're saying is we walk around with perhaps a false perception of life, and this false perception of the actual, like what life is really like, what's really going on in reality, lends itself to all the stuff that then comes and tries to disrupt our happiness, all the worries and all of the fears about what could be coming down the pike, and all the regrets, the mental chatter that is unnecessarily negative and destructive. And by getting any sense, any bit of the picture of something bigger, which I think Swedenborg sees a picture of, can that lift our mood? Let's see if we can do it here. And man, I wanted to start this. Go to Last Judgment. You can download it for free off of Swedenborg.com. Follow along. And I wanted to start in 15 subsection 3 here. But then I was realizing that the lead into this stuff is so important that we got to have it. And it just so happens to give you the reason why a Swedenborg happened. Like, why did he have this uninterrupted access to life after death and all this spiritual sounding stuff? He tells you straight up right here. So I'll skim through this, fly through it at amazing speeds. So right here up in this part, and you can read all this yourself, he's talking about the religious beliefs of his day in the Christian church he was a part of, in the Christian world in Western Europe at the time. And he's saying that a lot of this stuff doesn't make sense. And the impact that has threatens the human race. He says, because these beliefs are false, so the doctrines people are holding on to, they are full of darkness. And for people who base their thinking about matters on a sense of their own intelligence, these beliefs lead to a doubt and ultimately to denial. They say in their hearts, how can such a vast heaven with so many stars, with the sun and the moon be destroyed and disintegrate? This is talking about in the book of Revelation. It says the world's going to end, and people are like, wait a second. What are you talking about? This stuff is ridiculous. How can stars fall to the earth from heaven? Stars that are larger than the earth is? Yeah, really. You know, can a bowling ball fall onto a pin? Who fell onto what? How can bodies that have been eaten by worms, devoured by rot, or scattered by the winds be reassembled and reattached to their souls? This is the idea that you rise in the graves, but it's like if you shared atoms with another body. This stuff doesn't make sense. These and many similar questions, because they're incomprehensible, are not believable. For many, so you have these particular ideas in religion, all this stuff that we saw previously up there. And because they're so out there, and this is what you see when we started doing this show on the internet, on YouTube. I found YouTube absolutely full of these channels where people were breaking down the logical flaws and the ridiculousness of some religious beliefs, that they don't make any comprehensible sense to logic and how things should be laid out. And so you have these people that are en masse, migrating out of these religious traditions because they don't make any sense. They don't do anything. And Swedenborg is here making that argument a couple hundred years ago when this was really starting to get started, and saying that those false ideas around life after death, the gaudy kind of stuff, they have a risk that they can destroy the broader principles that are true. For many, they even destroy belief in our eternal life, in heaven and hell, and in all the rest of the principles of the church's faith. We can see this destruction taking place in people who say, who has come from heaven and told us this is true? Like, why don't we just get this angel coming and saying, this is exactly how it is. Why do we have to rely on cryptic old books that seem to have a lot of fact-checking issues? What is hell? Does it really exist? What's this business of people being tormented by fire to eternity? There are big ethical issues with the Christian doctrine as it was, and with a lot of religious traditions. What's Judgment Day? Haven't people been waiting in vain for it for centuries? Haven't I seen billboards on I-95 saying, this was a couple years ago, judgment's about to come? Didn't come. All this and more lead to a rejection of everything. So he seems to be saying, this is your classic baby with the bathwater. This is the bathwater. There's something good in there. Don't throw it all out, but some of it's got to be thrown out. This is the context. And this is the broad context that we still see why people are leaving religious traditions. This is the context that required the Swedenborg phenomenon to happen. To prevent people who think this way, as most people do who are held to be learned and well, that's a cool way to prove that I'm learned by barely pronouncing that, and well educated because they have worldly expertise, from further distressing and misleading people of simple faith and heart, and bringing about hellish darkness in regard to God, heaven, eternal life, and related matters, the Lord has opened the deeper levels of my spirit. So this is why Swedenborg happened. As he's piecing it together, all this stuff we have up here, the ideas that just obviously aren't true, that are being peddled by religion, and by religion being taken and stuck onto, like, oh, if you believe God, you also believe in the angry Father God that's going to destroy the human race unless, or you believe in a literal physical resurrection that's going to pull the physical bodies back together, even though there's all kinds of logistical problems with that. And they say, if you believe in God and heaven and hell, you believe in this stuff as well. And people are saying, well, we don't believe in that stuff, so we don't believe in any of it. And the people who are really good at critical thinking and are well educated, even more so, say, like, I can see that this is nothing, so I'm going to reject it. And Swedenborg was concerned about, you get people rejecting that, and they're able to dissuade people who just have a good belief in God is love, life continues on, be good, don't be bad, but that people who are on the right track, because they're not too absorbed in those particulars of principles, they may be pulled away because of this rejection of the intellectual principles of religion. And so Swedenborg is opened up to see all this stuff so that he can say, this is how it really is. Here's how it can make sense. I know we're not even getting to our spirit interview yet, but it's coming. But this is why Swedenborg can go do stuff like interview spirits. This is the purpose. The purpose is what defines a thing. Come on, isn't that interesting? Okay, sorry, we'll get right to it. This has made it possible for me to talk after their deaths with all the people I have ever known during their physical lives. With some of those I have talked for days. For some for months, with some for a whole year. You could go through his journal of spiritual experiences and see, like, he'll have an entry here, an entry here, an entry here, where there's just people that keep hanging around and showing up. I've also talked with so many other people that saying there were 100,000 of them would be an understatement. Many of these were in heaven and many were in the hells. Now that sounds like a lot of people. I did a quick calculation. If he's going for 30 years, that would be about, I did if it was 25 years-ish, that would be about 10 people a day. So that would be a packed schedule, but perhaps he's talking about groups. I don't know, man. Maybe he's just trying to make a point. I have talked with some people, and here we go. This is the interview. What's the mindset? If he's trying to set straight the ideas that we have about life after death, wouldn't it be helpful to get a perspective from the other side of it? What do people care about there? What's the implication? All of that. I've talked to some people on the third day after they died. And the third is like, we're getting into correspondences here. That's a very important day. Like, this is the completed state. So sometimes he says that that's when you wake up. Other times it seems more immediate, but it could be that because day is obviously not going to transfer right from physical to spiritual. Does this mean you're in the completed state of transitioning on? I don't know. And I've told them that arrangements were being made for their burial and funeral. And isn't that, I know I'm going to pause on a comment here, but isn't that fascinating to think, we have people that we know and love that move on, and we're thinking about, okay, we got to get the funeral ready, get everyone together. Isn't it interesting to think about they're somewhere else? Like, learning and growing and having experiences while this is going on. Like, and if you could have this bridge between the worlds, you could say, by the way, your funeral's today. Are you going to be able to make it? Which prompted them to say that they had done well in casting off what had served them for a body and its functions in the world. In another area where he tells his story, he says, they were shocked to think, like, they're not being buried. I'm not being buried. Sure, this thing I was using was being buried. They wanted me to tell their loved ones that they were not dead, but alive, and were just as human now as ever. It's interesting because we often wonder, do people, since we go through such grief and pain when we lose people, are they thinking about us, and do they care about what we're going through, and what matters to them now? And this is just one survey, but I think there's two potent notes here. One, there's two things they want to communicate. One is that they're not dead. They're like, hey, I'm okay. I'm still here, and I'm still me. And life is still life. And you get this cool picture of what that consists of. They said they had simply crossed over from one world into another and had no awareness of having lost anything. Since they had a body, and this is why didn't they lose something? Obviously, they lost their earthly situation. They lost temporarily their connection to people like us. What do they retain that makes them feel like they've still got their framework? Since they had a body, and this will be a spiritual body, and sensory faculties just as they had before, they had understanding and will just as before. So, sorry, we got to break this down. You ever think about, I've had the idea of heaven in my mental catalog for a long time. Since I was little, I was taught that there's such a thing as heaven. But do you ever think about, you could be in heaven and actually like look around and pick something up? And to me, that's like, that's very particular and specific to think that life continues with those little details as well, not just like, we're somewhere. That may sound like a meaningless distinction, but to me, several times I've had this like, whoa moment about that. And sensory faculties. So they hear, they see, they smell, they taste, just as they had before. And then look, they have understanding and will, just as before. So you think and you feel things just like before. They had the same kind of thoughts and feelings that you could be you. Like, wow, think about what you're like when you're in some place, like you go visit some landmark and you're like, this is what it's like. It's you there, like, this is what heaven is like. I wonder if I should go over here. The same kind of sensations, even the same kind of pleasures and desires as they had in the world. So all this together, you think about what makes us us. They're saying this is what made them feel like, I'm still here. I'm still here. I'm still going. Many who have just died, on seeing that they are still people and still alive as they were before, and in similar circumstances, this is interesting. I've given that label a few times. I'll try to think of a different word than interesting for the next one. I know you don't care. Since for all of us, our first state after death is much like the one we had in the world, though this changes gradually for us into either heaven or hell. And going so far as to, in some places, describing people who don't really realize that they've died. That initially, and I don't know if that's even like, I'm back to my regular job or I'm in the same hospital that I was, but there's a similar state before when we're caught up in this same kind of life. And changes for us into either heaven or hell depending on where we really what we really love and what we're really pulled to. But look at the reaction you have when you're realizing that there's that life goes on. Because here you may feel like, life is a drag, but there, so when all this is seen, are touched with a new joy at being alive, and say they had not believed it would be like this. And I think even people like me who go around and talk about, there's life after death, and Swedenborg says that. I really think there's Swedenborg, and I read near-death experiences. I'm sure if it really happens, that I would have this moment of like, this is real. And that they have not just that, wow, this is really it, but this is awesome. That there is something, I do notice that as wrapped up in the inconveniences and the stresses of life as I can be, as soon as I feel like anything is threatened, of it. Like I do feel like, oh my gosh, what if something bad happened or some kind of scare or something like that? Immediately you feel how much you actually, or for me anyway, how much you actually do treasure the stuff that's regular, the stuff that's routine. And I think that this is sort of that joy, but this actually does go on. And this is awesome. That this thing that I sometimes took for granted is real and continuing. They're absolutely amazed that they had been so ignorant and blind about what happens to us after death, and are even more amazed, and this brings in the context I threw at you in the beginning, that people in the church have the same ignorance and blindness, even though they of all people on the planet have access to light on such matters. I think even today, there's more in the air that we survive, and that we survive as people. In Swedenborg's day, there was a lot of ideas of, but what I think you yourself may have a belief that you don't, like you're not conscious until you get resurrected in the future, or that consciousness just ceases at death or whatever. That's fine, and it may be, though, I think there's more of the belief that there's a transition to an afterlife where you are similar to what you are now than there was in Swedenborg's day. But Swedenborg, the point he's making here, often like a reformer and a critic of the religion he was in, he's saying these people are like, well, I went to church and we were all learning about what I thought was like spiritual stuff, and don't we talk about God in this organization about God and heaven and stuff, and we basically didn't know anything about this. It's like we were getting prepped for college and nobody even told us that you have classes. This is their feeling. And look at why they believe that they were so unprepared for what comes. You'd think it would be because we had the wrong ideas, but it always comes back to motivation. Then they begin for the first time to see the reason for this blindness and ignorance. What is it? That outward concerns, worldly and bodily preoccupations, had so completely taken over and filled their minds that they could not be raised into heaven's light and look beyond the things they had been taught, and so see what the church is really all about. And I know that we've touched on this number before somewhere in this channel. I'm hoping it wasn't a previous News from Heaven. Don't check our back catalog. But I know we've dissected this a bit. It's certainly worth a redissection, because there's a couple of really potent packets of thought in there. One is that this worldly and bodily, bodily is not just I'm hungry. Swedenborg lumps all the negative stuff into that category. So bodily preoccupation could be the preoccupation with you're trying to become as eminent as you can, or your obsession with being superior to others. Swedenborg says that's a lowest level craving and would call that bodily or outermost. Worldly being similar, the pursuit of wealth or of advantages, along with the pursuit of gratifications. All this stuff that we know. That this is what Ebenezer Scrooge was into, this stuff. That's why he's the villain initially in the Muppet Christmas Carol, I was going to say, because it's my favorite version. And I have to mention that movie once every couple shows. So you have this sort of stuff, though. Selfishness and materialism is the best way to say it. When that is in you, it actually cuts off this sort of subtle subconscious access we have to the truth, because it gets it so that you can't get this perception that there's something more. And what that would do for you is, even if you were raised in a system where you're taught ridiculous or untrue or immoral or something, religious principles, Swedenborg is saying you should be able to, if you have this inner light, if you're really seeking what's good and true, what's really right, what's really true, in a way that, and you're trying to push back against the negative tendencies, you should be able to rise above whatever doctrine you're in and see what the church is really all about. This is how you know when he says church, he's talking about something more than just a physical building and more than just the doctrines or the ideas you're taught. Because if he's saying go beyond what you were taught by your religious community and see what the church is really all about, the church is the state in the heart and mind where you know and perceive the truth. This is the space God is trying to make in every person individually. That's why I love it, because it's this universal. If you're looking for what's good, that leads you to what's true. And this is something that no matter where you start, you can get to. But because, at least in Swedenborg's day, maybe it's changed, there was so much preoccupation with the things of selfishness and materialism, there wasn't this ability of people to reject false ideas and gravitate to true ones. It was just reject false ideas and reject everything that relates to everything spiritual in there. When bodily and worldly things are loved as much as they are nowadays, sounds like a grumpy old man, like, much as the kids love bodily and worldly things, nothing but utter darkness flows in from them when we try to think about heavenly realities beyond the teachings on faith proclaimed by our church. Because when you get people who are really potently lit up about spiritual stuff, it's always because they've weighed it in their own mind to an extent. I mean, you can get people who are very much in sync with the stuff they're taught by a religious community, but they love it on their own as well. Like, they really have weighed these ideas and they believe them. And that's what you need to get this living idea of what's beyond. And it's such a subtle difference in the mind, because I watch myself go through, because I'm talking about spiritual concepts on shows like this all the time, and you can go from a very wooden, unbelievable picture of, or not very probable or realistic idea of, you can hear something like heaven and life after death, and just form this sort of poor sketch of it that you wouldn't be as in line with how the rest of life is, and it seems very like this is not true. But you can have the same words trigger a much more living and meaningful and like it belongs in, I was going to say like non sequitur means it doesn't fit, so a sequitur picture of what life after death is. This is just this little flip in the mind. And I think that there can be the difference between a system of belief in a spiritual and a God and heaven and all that seem plausible versus artificial and wooden. And it seems like it's all about this light getting there in us. So hopefully we can, instead of having worldly and selfish and materialistic things at the center, they can be at the peripheries. We can indulge from time to time. We can have that as one thing, but not the main thing. When the main thing is love and truth, that's when we see what's really true. And if we go back to the head in the clouds, like all this stuff here, this is kind of like even more immediate than negative religious principles. These are just negative life principles that we're not even maybe taught, but are just taken advantage of by the clouds in our mind. That taking the stuff we do believe, and from that weaving stories that are detrimental to us and cause us fear and shame and guilt and everything like that. This, when we can be helpless to try to look above and beyond and see something. But when we get rational explanations, when we get ideas that make sense about how there could be a greater reality here, even though it doesn't always appear like that, I find to me, when those pieces start to fall into place, it automatically allows me to start to reach beyond these. And it lets the light in, dispelling this stuff, gives you a chance to think about things in a way that does liberate you. So hopefully you've gotten a little teeny bit of that here watching this show, and that's the news from heaven. I love doing it. Thank you for letting me talk about this. Hopefully you got something good out of it. If you did, you don't have to be a stranger. You can write it in the comments. I'm sure other people would love to hear about what's useful to you, what you've done, because even if people are interested or not interested in spiritually stuff or Swedenborg stuff, everybody's interested in clearing up the mind, leading to happiness where there was confusion and pain before. So sharing is caring. Let me know how it's going for you. Like and subscribe. That would be cool. And I hope that you can take these ideas and have a good day, and more than a good day. I hope you have a really good life. All right. Talk to you soon.